Hey again, 8th graders. I wanted to give you a little bit of an intro to the two books that we'd be studying this week. The first one is Galatians. The author is obviously going to be Paul. We haven't deviated at all from that. So far this year, again, if you're taking the test later on, remember that other than the four Gospels, the only other author has been Paul. Every epistle that we've read has been a Pauline epistle. This one is written not to a town like Rome, Romans. It is written to the churches in Galatia, which is a region. If you remember from when we did our missionary maps from Acts, it's not a particular town. It's probably to kind of a group of churches. And the main issue that's going on is false teaching, and particularly the fact that people are accepting the false teaching. And most of that false teaching seems to be centered around a group that's going to be called many things throughout the rest of the New Testament. Paul is kind of sassy about it, and so he'll refer to them as the Judaizers or the dogs or the mutilators of the flesh or the circumcision party. They're all the same people. And what it is a group of people coming in and trying to impose old Jewish regulations on the new Christian believers. So because of that, the dating of Galatians is kind of interesting. He doesn't make any mention at all of the Jerusalem Council, if you remember the Jerusalem Council from Acts 15. And it seems like in dealing with an issue like this, he probably would if that council had already happened. So based on that, it's possible that Galatians was one of the earlier books written down in the New Testament. And that we don't know that for sure, but it's definitely possible. So the tone of Galatians is going to be probably the most agitated, the most fiery of Paul's letters, because he's really, really upset about this group of Judaizers who has convinced the Christians in Galatia that they need to add something else onto the gospel. Remember that one of Paul's overall goals is defending the gospel all the time, and the true gospel, and distinguishing it from false. So you see that tone right away from the very beginning. I made some notes for you for when you do your structure map, but you get a pretty good idea of it, because instead of a blessing or a prayer or something like that to start off, he says this instead. In chapter 1, he says, "I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all." So right from the get-go, he calls out the false teachers and tells them that he wants them to be cursed. So he's literally saying he wants them to be sent to hell because they're leading people astray and teaching them a false gospel. After that, he'll spend some time talking about the way that his gospel is true. So if it seems like he talks about himself a lot and his credentials, that's why. He just wants to show you that he is preaching a gospel that is true. And it'll be necessary for him to explain a lot of his background in order to do that. And that dispute with the leaders will become very clear as you read through the book. And then he'll kind of close out the first section where he'll even actually rebuke Cephas, who, if you remember, is Peter, right? So he'll even rebuke Peter, saying, "Hey, Peter, like, you had this same experience of accepting the Gentiles just as they are." If you remember Acts 10, when Peter had his vision and he welcomed Cornelius in, and he says, "You live like a Gentile," meaning you don't follow the Jewish laws until you're around other Jews, and then you become kind of hypocritical and tell the Gentiles that they need to do Jewish things. So he'll go into all of that, and then he'll end chapter 2 with these verses. "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." And then here's the key verse. "I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing." So you kind of see why he's so worked up about this issue. Because if the gospel is true, it is based totally on the grace of God and not on anything that we add to it by following the law. So pretty powerful and, again, pretty fiery in tone. Ephesians is going to be a little bit different. Ephesus is going to be a little bit more specific region. Paul lived there for quite a while. He parted with them very sadly and had a lot of affection for them. So where Galatians is fiery, Ephesians is going to be much more friendly. It's not going to be as pointed and specific. Some people even think Ephesians was probably a round letter, a circular letter, which meant that it was passed through the region. So he's not tackling one particular issue like he was in Galatians. And it is also very, very theologically rich and with a lot of practical application. So get yourself prepared for a lot of long run-on sentences where he just lays out complexities in doctrine, one after another, all within the same thought. So you might have to take your time and break a few of those down when you're reading, and you'll get a lot out of that, I think. Some of my favorite parts in it are found in chapter 2, although the whole book is really good. Both of these books have some similarities to Romans. In Romans, you see him laying out that the gospel is by faith and not by following the law. So you see that in Galatians. And in Ephesians, you get a lot of that gorgeous theology that you get in Romans, but condensed into just a few chapters. So it's kind of a condensed version of Romans with a little bit different emphasis. So chapter 2, he talks about going from death to life, and he says this: as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live when you followed the ways of the world. And he kind of goes on there. And I want to emphasize that he says that you're dead, right? If you are sick with sin, which some people will sometimes say, right? Like our hearts are sick. If you're sick, you can go to a hospital, you can follow the doctor's orders and try to make yourself well. That's not what Paul's saying here. Paul's saying you are already utterly and completely beyond hope, right? You were dead. But then he says, but God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. And then he'll talk about the implications of that, and he'll talk about why Christ did that. But again, that same emphasis through grace. For it is by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And then the last thing that I want to do is to share with you a little bit of Paul's prayer. And I want to read it out loud just because I want to echo that prayer for you guys as we're apart. And that is in chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. He says, I keep asking that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you may know him better. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people, and his incomparably great power for those of us who believe. And that is my prayer for you this week.